Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Jurisprudence Discussion Group. This is our second seminar of the Hilary Term 2022. We have the pleasure today of being joined by Jonathan Parry, Assistant Professor at the Department of Philosophy, Logic and Scientific Method at the London School of Economics. Today, we will be discussing Jonathan's paper, What's Wrong with Paternalism. Hello again, Jonathan. Welcome to the JDG. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much for inviting me. So really looking forward to seeing what you think. So this very much is first draft. This isn't false modesty. So yeah, very open to being proved wrong. We'll see what happens. Okay, so let me just share slides with you. Okay, so can you all see that all right? Okay, excellent. Okay, so topic today is a question of what's wrong with paternalism. So obviously lots of things are often wrong with paternalism. So presumably we have reasons not to manipulate people or coerce people or lie to people. The question I'm interested in is what, if anything, is kind of the distinctive wrong of paternalism, which isn't reducible to these other more familiar moral wrongs. Okay, so let's start off just with an extreme case. I cooked up a case which I hope a few of us will disagree with. So the story goes something like this, call it health kick. Imagine we have Julia. She smokes, she drinks, she eats poorly, she rarely exercises. She occasionally resolves to adopt a healthier lifestyle, but soon falls back into her previous ways. I guess given that it's January, this might be a familiar tale to some of us. If left to her own devices, Julia's welfare is likely to plummet over time, likely leading to a premature death. Now, Julia's neighbour judges that Julia is imprudent and weak-willed, and out of concern for Julia, neighbour does things like hiding Julia's cigarettes, buys all the alcohol in Julia's local off-license, cajoles Julia into exercising, places nicotine patches on Julia's skin, all that kind of stuff. So I take it there are kind of two judgments which seem relatively uncontroversial. I take it first of all, neighbour paternalistically, treats Julia paternalistically. And secondly, I take it to be reasonably uncontroversial that neighbour acts wrongly, all things considered. But most importantly, it seems that the judgment that neighbour acts wrongly is in at least some way grounded in the judgment that neighbour treats Julia paternalistically. It looks like the wrongness has something to do with it being paternalistic. And the question is, well, what's the nature of that connection? What's the judgment of wrongness supposed to be tracking? Okay, so that's the task, to try and make some progress on that question. What exactly is paternalism in general? I've only given you one case. Now, there are some quite boring sort of debates about exactly how we should define paternalism. I'm just going to go with what I take to be a fairly standard definition. I don't think anything I say in the talk is going to rely on precifying this any further. But the basic thought is paternalism seems to involve three rough features. So first of all, it seems to involve some sort of action, normally cashed out in terms of one person's interfering with another. Second, it looks like the interference has to be against the will, in at least some relevant sense, of the person who's interfered with. Kind of consent nullifies, whatever's wrong with paternalism, or even consent makes actions not even paternalistic to begin with, perhaps. And finally, you don't just need some sort of interference against the will of the person who's interfered with. It also has to be done for a certain kind of reason. So the thought is that paternalistic actions involve interfering with somebody against their will, and that action is justified by the interferer by reference to the fact they think it'll be good for the person who's interfered with if they act. So they're motivated or aim at the well-being of the interferee. Okay, that's the basic thought. So much for definitions. And I think the question I'm interested in is, well, what, if anything, is supposed to be distinctively wrong with paternalism? I think there are three kind of rough camps of views you can go for. Perhaps there are others. I'd be interested to see what you think. So one class of views, which I'm not going to discuss very much in the talk, is what I call the welfare view. So the idea here is that when paternalism is wrong, it's wrong just because it kind of fails to actually do any good. Normally the thought is here, paternalism is wrong because it really just makes people worse off rather than better off. Second kind of view you often find in the literature, very common, says something to do with autonomy. So the thought here is something like, we ought to respect people's autonomy. Treating people paternalistically involves disrespecting their autonomy. their right to be the author of their own lives, something like that. And that explains what the distinctive wrong of paternalism is. And one final class of views getting increasingly popular these days is what I call the insult view. So the idea here isn't so much that you kind of transgress someone's autonomy when you treat them paternalistically. Rather, the thought is paternalism is wrong when it's wrong based on us having a certain kind of judgment about the person who is paternalized. And in particular, the thought is that paternalism is wrong because it is either motivated by or expresses the judgment that the paternalizee is kind of prudentially incompetent in some way. So they're not able to successfully run their own lives. They're not able to effectively promote their own well-being. And the thought is, expressing insults or whatever it may be is wrong because it's disrespectful to others. It's not an appropriate way to relate to our moral equals, to treat them as not able to run their own lives. Okay, so these are the kind of three views I think you often find out there in the literature. So I'm not going to say much about the welfare view. I'll talk about the autonomy view and the insult view a little bit, just as a way of hopefully trying to springboard into my own view. Before I do that, let me just say one thing about why I think this question of the wrong of paternalism is should be of general interest. If you're interested in moral theory. So I tend to think that paternalism is interesting because if we think there is this kind of special constraint on paternalistic action, this kind of suggests that there's this kind of special constraint on promoting the good out there, like that sometimes it can be wrong to bring about a state of affairs, even though that state of affairs contains kind of more of what is good. And if you think that's the essence of paternalism, or sorry, that anti-paternalism captures that kind of constraint, I tend to think that anti-paternalism is just one aspect, maybe of a more kind of general non-consequentialist approach to moral theory. And some of the same puzzles about a non-consequentialist approach, I think, also apply to paternalism. So if you think there's something kind of paradoxical or weird about the idea that sometimes it can be wrong to do what's best, then I think anti-paternalist intuitions are just kind of one particular expression of that more general underlying thought. Okay, so why do I think the autonomy and insult views don't work, despite their kind of intuitive attractiveness? Well, I think they fail to get the intuitively right result in cases like this. So first of all, we've just got our initial health kick case, and here's a kind of variation case. So I call it the welfare bomb case. So in this case, an evil villain hides a bomb in a city, and the bomb will kill one innocent random person if it explodes. The detonator for the bomb is connected to a welfare-ometer, which infallibly monitors Julia's levels of welfare. If Julia's welfare drops below a certain level, the bomb will explode. Moreover, if Julia is informed about the situation, the bomb will also explode. Now again, if left to her own devices, Julia's welfare is likely to plummet, leading to a premature death. Julia's neighbour judges that Julia is imprudent and weak-willed, and in order to prevent the bomb from exploding, neighbour does all the same stuff that neighbour does in the initial health kit case. So he continually interferes in Julia's life in order to keep her welfare sufficiently high. So neighbour buys all the alcohol, bribes and cajoles Julia into exercising, secretly places the nicotine patches, etc., etc., etc. So here are two judgments which I submit for your consideration. My view, in the health kick case, clearly a case of paternalism. I mean, if that's a case of isn't a case of paternalism, I have no idea what is. And second, I think neighbour acts all things considered wrongly. Welfare bomb case, I think this isn't a case of paternalism in any sense. And I think neighbour may well act morally permissibly. At very least, there's a significant moral asymmetry between the two cases. So I think what neighbour does in welfare bomb is intuitively much easier to justify than what neighbour does in the health kit case. Okay, so I take those judgments to be reasonably uncontroversial. I'll be intrigued to see if you disagree with me. But here's the relevance. I'm tempted to think that both the autonomy view and the insult view, surprisingly, aren't able to distinguish these two cases in the way that I think is quite obvious. So it looks like in both cases, what neighbour does to Julia kind of equally infringes her autonomy. I mean, whatever actions or whatever way that neighbour treats Julia in health kick are identical to the way that neighbour treats Julia in welfare bomb. I can't see any autonomy-based difference between the two cases. I also can't see any insult-based difference between the two cases. It looks like in both cases, neighbour acts on the basis of exactly the same judgment, that Julia is prudentially incompetent. So it strikes me that whatever insult is present in one case should also be present in both cases. So therefore, it strikes me that this putative wrong-making feature of paternalism, which the autonomy and the insult views postulate, as far as I can tell, equally applies in both cases, which leads me to think that neither of those views correctly identify what's supposed to be distinctively wrong with paternalistic interference, if there is indeed anything distinctively wrong with it. Okay, so that's the thought. That's the puzzle which is supposed to kind of motivate the search for an alternative conception of the wrong of paternalism. So let's just do a little bit of diagnosis. So what exactly is the relevant difference between the two cases? I think the answer is obvious, and it's already there in our, extremely sort of mainstream definition of paternalism. It's all about the reason component. So the key difference between the two cases is the end of the agent, neighbour's goal. So obviously in both cases, there's a sense in which neighbour acts in order to promote Julia's well-being. But in the health kit case, that's neighbour's ultimate end, right? That's the end that they appeal to justify what they do. Whereas in the welfare bomb case, the end which neighbour appeals to justify their action isn't Julia's good. Rather, it's the good of the innocent person who is threatened by the bomb going off. There's some third party who would be benefited by what neighbour does to Julia. Right, so I think it's very obvious what the difference between the two cases is, which I think is additionally striking, that neither I think the autonomy view nor the insult view really gives the reason component this essential non-contingent role in the explanation of what's supposed to be wrong with paternalism. Right, so it's often the case, I think, that the autonomy and the insult views get the right results, because it's just often the case, in the cases that those views discuss, the interference is done for the sake of the person whose autonomy is infringed and whose prudential capacities are insulted. But I think, as the well-being bomb case shows, you can construct cases where that, those features obtain, but the distinctive wrong of paternalism seems absent. So it strikes me that we, whatever the right conception of paternalism's wrongness is, it has to give some fundamental role to the reason component. It has to explain why acting for a kind of benevolent reason grounds the wrong, non-contingently. But I think this also raises a further kind of puzzle. So while it seems, I guess, fairly straightforward to explain why insulting people is wrong and why infringing people's autonomy seems wrong, grounding the wrong of paternalism in benevolence, in the reason component of the definition, you might think is kind of weird, right? You might think, normally the fact that one's action benefits another person is a good-making feature or a right-making feature of one's action, right? Yet, if it's true that the distinctive wrong of paternalism involves benefiting others, kind of, you might think there's something kind of weirdly, almost paradoxical about the wrong of paternalism. If you think there's something wrong with paternalism, you seem to be committed to the view that, for some reason, the kind of moral valence of benevolence somehow flips in these cases. What's normally a right-making feature is now a wrong-making feature. So it's something kind of odd and puzzling about the anti-paternalist intuition in general, I think. Okay, so what do I think is the right view? What do I think is the view which can both explain the distinctive wrong of paternalism and hopefully do so in a way which avoids this sort of paradoxical flavour? So I think the way to do it is in terms of positing a certain kind of moral power in persons. Apologies if you can hear my kids screaming in the background. Okay, so what are moral powers? I mean, I take it for this audience, this is probably not something which needs to be explained in too much detail. Moral powers are basically abilities to change the normative or moral situation via some act of will, via some declaration. So take, for example, classic cases, our moral powers to consent, to promise, or maybe even to command other people. So when we consent via an act of declaration, we waive rights, we give people permissions to do things that they would ordinarily be under a duty, a directed duty, not to perform. When we promise, we kind of place duties on ourselves and give other people rights. And when we command, we're at least attempting to impose duties on other people directly. So think about some applications of this. Probably most obvious is think about our rights and powers with respect to our bodies and our property. So, with respect to my body, I can consent to you touching it, thereby, releasing you from duties, not to touch me. With respect to my property, I can consent to you using it, I can transfer it to you, with respect to both my body and property, I can make promises with respect to what I do with my body and property, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So here's the central proposal. I think we should try and explain the distinctive wrong of paternalism in terms of people having a particular kind of moral power. And the basic thought is something like this. In the same way that each of us has rights to control the use of our bodies and property, so what we might call ordinary material resources, I claim we have structurally similar rights to control where other people can use our good, so what we might call our moral resources. So let me to unpack that a little bit for you. So what do I mean by our goods? Well, I just mean something like moral reasons grounded in a person's well-being. What do I mean by using someone's good? I mean justifying your actions by appealing to those moral reasons, to the fact it would be good for a person if we acted in a certain way. And the basic idea, just to kind of give you a bit of some spoilers, I think that paternalism is wrong because it kind of treats us as lacking this power. So when we treat people in a way which intuitively seems like a case of wrongful paternalism, what's going on is I'm kind of committing a form of kind of trespass against that person. I'm using something, their good, without their consent, in the same way that kind of I wrong someone when I trespass on their property or use their property without their consent. I kind of treat that person as lacking control over a domain when they in fact do have control over it. So I kind of disrespect them in that way. Okay, so just before we get to some arguments for this view, let me just keep it on time. I think I've got about 15-20 minutes, if that's all right. Here's just what I think is a virtue of the view. It explains, I think, these two cases quite nicely. So according to the moral power view of the wrong of paternalism, the way we should explain the difference between the two cases is something like this. In the health kick case, what neighbour does is they kind of distinctively wrong Julia by trying to use her good to justify their actions without her consent or against her will. So that's the kind of distinctive directed wrong against Julia. And in addition, neighbour's action is all things considered wrong because the reasons that would otherwise justify that interference, the fact that it would be really good for Julia, are rendered kind of unavailable. That's a resource which can't be used for that purpose. It's kind of inadmissible in the court of moral justification. So I think this talk of inadmissibility, I think, is present in David's paper on paternalism as well. In the welfare bomb case, by contrast, the moral power view says something like this. Well, look, obviously Julia does exactly the same things. Sorry, neighbour does exactly the same things to Julia. Right, so they interfere with Julia in exactly the same way, but they don't commit this particular form of trespass against Julia because they don't justify their actions by appealing to the fact it's good for Julia. Rather, they justify their actions by appealing to the fact it's good for the third party. So kind of none of Julia's moral resources are kind of used against her will, so to speak, in this case. Kind of Julia's sovereignty over her good, we might say, is respected by neighbour, even though obviously her kind of sovereignty over her life in terms of whether she's physically interfered with or not, that right is not respected. Okay, so I think it's a virtue of the theory that it gets an intuitively right result in this kind of pairs of cases, and I've got some additional cases at the end if we have time and if people are really interested. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's the view. Paternalism is wrong because it treats people as lacking a right they in fact have, the moral power to control the use of our good. So a virtue of the view, I think is reasonably extensionally adequate, gets the right results in the right cases. But someone might say, well, look, fine, positing the power does have these advantages, but why think that people actually have this power? What's the underlying rationale, or what's the value in people's possessing the moral power? So this kind of challenge to my view of paternalism, I guess, kind of connects up with general debates about the justification of moral powers. You know, why I think that people in fact have these distinctive normative abilities. So here are a few arguments, a few possible foundations for this moral power. So I'll skip through the first two quite quickly because I don't think I'm particularly convinced by these, but I'd be interested to see what you think. It's the final three that I think are the most interesting. So the first thing we might say is just appeal to something like brute self-ownership. So we might say something like, well, look, by analogy, think about my rights to control my body and my property. Why do I have those rights? And you might just, stamp your feet and say, look, they're just mine. I own those things. And that's just, the end of the story. There's nowhere further to go. So in a different context, a friend of mine, Cephalazar, I think has a view a bit like this. His really interesting paper called Moral Options and Self-Ownership, or something like that. And he makes the following claim. He claims if some fact that makes the world a better place, and here we might plug in the concept of well-being as being one fact of that kind. If our well-being is kind of something which ineluctably and exclusively is part of your life, then you should have some special authority over how that fact features in the justification of your actions and those of others. So I think the thought here is that, we're just so enmeshed with our own well-being, with reasons kind of grounded in our welfare. But, there's a sense in which they're kind of part of us, kind of analogous to how our limbs are part of us. And if you think we just have these strong self-ownership rights to control what's done with our bodies and perhaps also of our property, you should think a similar thing about our rights to control what you might call our normative property. So my view is that sounds quite plausible to me. I think I'm on board with that. But it strikes me as kind of table thumping. It doesn't seem like it really adds that much to the story that I've already told. It just seems like, I think, a different way of expressing the idea, but perhaps doesn't seem to take us much further in terms of identifying foundations. Maybe there's no further foundations to be found, but I think it would be nice to explore them. Okay, second possible view, or class of views, this will be familiar to lots of you, I'm sure, adopts the following strategy. We try to justify moral powers by appealing to the interests that are served, or the value that's realized by people having those powers. So very familiar, sort of Raz-inspired interest theory of rights here. So the general strategy here would be to say people have, in fact, the moral power to control the use of their goods because it's good for us in some way to have that power. Interesting question. In what ways could it be good for us? And here's one plausible thought to me. You might just say, autonomy can play that justifying interest role. So, what is autonomy? Obviously, big debate there. But let's just, stipulate something to do with being the value of being the author of one's own life. And then, you might just say something like, well, if we have the power to control the use of our good, well, that enhances in some way the degree to which we're the authors of our life. Right? More control, more autonomy. I take it as is the kind of inference going on here. So what's my view? I'm just not sure yet. I'd be intrigued to see what you think. I think my basic dissatisfaction at this point is that it's not clear to me why, at least as people standardly, I think, understand the value of autonomy, it is really served by having this distinctive power to control kind of the normative landscape as opposed to the material environment. So I thought it's something like this. I take it standardly when we talk about having an interest in autonomy, what we really mean is something like an interest in what happens to us, like an interest in how our lives go, kind of non-normatively speaking, sort of almost causally speaking. So the interests have like a non-normative object, in most cases, like how other people behave. That's what we're concerned with. But the moral power in question, the one we're interested in, seems like it must track an interest in controlling kind of not what people do per se, but rather kind of the reasons that are eligible to justify what other people do. And it's just not clear to me that kind of standard conceptions of autonomy are tracking that. Now, of course, maybe we could now just expand our conception of autonomy and say, we care not only about being the author of our non-normative lives, how our lives go, how other people behave, what happens to us. Perhaps we also have an interest in controlling kind of what that bit of the normative landscape constituted by our well-being does, in a sense, right? So we have a kind of direct autonomy interest in controlling the normative landscape. So to use one of David Owens's phrases. maybe that's right. Then it strikes me that we're kind of expanding our conception of autonomy into a new area. And if that's right, I would like to hear more about what exactly the interest is in terms of having direct control over the normative realm. So I'm going to offer another couple of interest-based arguments now, which I think might be kind of maybe folded into this general autonomy argument, but there are more, I think, satisfying and specific way of trying to understand why we might have this kind of non-instrumental concern in the reasons that other people can act for. Okay, so the first thought is something like this. It tracks one way of, one kind of popular way of trying to justify normative powers. And you do so in terms of the kind of valuable relationships or valuable intimacy that having those powers makes possible. So the basic thought here is something like this. Certain kinds of intimate relationships are good for us, and moral powers are justified because and to the extent that they are constituents of those relationships. They make possible the value that's realized in those relationships. So a classic example here would be someone like Shauna Schifrin's view of promising. Schifrin points out, imagine we didn't have the power to bind ourselves to each other via promising. Our relationship, she thinks, would be impoverished for lacking this power. Since our relationships are valuable in the way that we think they are, we do in fact have the power. That's the kind of rough chain of inference. So my thought is maybe this kind of argument might be marshaled not in defense of more familiar normative powers like the power to promise or perhaps the power to consent, but also perhaps this very specific power, the power to control the use of one's good. So the connection starts from the following observation. The thought is that, well, intimate relationships, let's take friendship as a paradigm, involve kind of special permissions to enter into each other's personal spaces. So friends can often kind of touch or use one's bodies and property in ways that would be wrongful if a stranger did so. So friends can borrow your stuff without asking. Classic case, like friends can do things which would be property trespasses without having to ask you first, in ways that strangers can't. So our kind of, our intimate domains are kind of accessible to one another when we're friends. And the thought is that's kind of constitutive of the valuable relationship. Like, imagine me and you think we're friends, but it turns out that we don't have special access to each other's personal domains in a way that strangers, lack that access. I think it's kind of odd to say that we're actually friends. I think we would discover, if we discovered that we didn't have this access, that we weren't in fact friends. We're at best associates or something else, but we don't in fact enjoy the valuable intimate relationship without these special intimacy permissions. And so the final step in the argument is the following kind of extension of that thought. The thought is that having this kind of valuable access to our friends and intimates isn't just access to non-normative domains like each other's bodies and properties. It's also valuable kind of intimate access to our good, to moral reasons kind of grounded in us. So the thought is we can kind of justify the power by saying something like this. It's good for us because it enables a special kind of intimate access to one another, to each other's goods. Further thought is that the value of having that access doesn't just depend on the access itself, but also having it exclusively. So, part of what it means for us to be friends with each other is not just that I can kind of justify my actions by appealing to the fact that they're good for you, I have access to your good, but that I have it in a way that strangers don't. I'm picked out as special as part of being in the relationship, so to speak. And the claim would be that our having the power is necessary to give us this kind of exclusivity, which is itself a kind of constituent part of the value of the special kind of normative access to each other. So the thought would be, look, if we lack the power, we wouldn't be able to kind of pick out certain people as special to us in the sense that those people have this privileged access, exclusive access to our good. That's the rough thought. I'd be intrigued to see what you think. Let me just keep an eye on the time. Great, I think another five to 10 minutes and I should be done. Here's one further interest-based argument for the moral power. I call it the interest in moral divestment. And again, the starting point is by thinking about our moral powers with respect to kind of familiar objects like property. So the starting thought is that, we don't like being implicated in things that we morally disagree with. And it's valuable for us to be able to divest ourselves from contributing to those ends. So obvious example, think about how we can kind of withdraw our property from contributing to ends that we think are morally objectionable. So, you know, boycotting trades that we think is morally wrongful in some way. And I think it's good for us to have that power. And perhaps among the many reasons that our powers to control property might be justified, I think an interest in controlling the ends that we are kind of complicit in, causally speaking, are among the interests that might justify our property rights. And here's an extension of that thought then, into the normative domain. I think when people justify their actions by appealing to the fact it would be good for us to perform them, there's a sense, I think, in which we're implicated in their actions. We're kind of normatively implicated or justificatorily implicated rather than causally, but implicated nonetheless. And I think we have a similar kind of interest in not being implicated, in not being complicit in a certain sense, in the outcomes that people promote for our sake. So just to give you one example of this, I think, you know, take the case of anti-war protests, I think is an interesting one. So think about the 2003 British anti-war protesters slogan, "Not in my name." I think that one thing that's going on in the kind of public expression of that sentiment is not just the protesters saying, we think the war is a bad or a wrong, ought not to be the case that the war is fought. There's also a particular kind of justificatory element to that. The sentiment behind the slogan, I think, is saying something like, don't do it for our sake, don't do it for us. Don't implicate us in the justification of the outcome. And I find that slogan kind of very evocative and very interesting. And I think it's actually tracking this interest. I think intuitive, but kind of hard to articulate interest in not being normatively implicated in outcomes. And I think given we have that interest, it's kind of valuable for us to have control over kind of whether our good, or maybe other kinds of moral resources that reside in us, stand in a justifying relation to other people's actions. Right. So I think the moral power to control the use of our good is valuable for us because we have this interest in what I call moral divestment. Okay. Yeah, one final argument for you. I think this is the most interesting one, but it's in a way the hardest to articulate. The way this argument works, it doesn't appeal to people's interests, so it doesn't say we have the power because it's good for us in some sense to have it. Rather, it says something like this: persons have a high moral status. Were we to lack the moral power to control the use of our good, we would have a lower moral status. We do in fact have a higher moral status, therefore we have the power. So for those of you who are familiar with kind of Nagel and Kamm's arguments for rights as side constraints, the argument has a similar kind of structure to those arguments. So as Kamm puts it, you know, in her discussion of why we have rights not to be harmed, she thinks if we lacked rights, we would be kind of more inviolable, and we would just kind of, we wouldn't have the exalted moral status that we take ourselves to have. So my argument is kind of in that ballpark. I mean, if you think that argument is bonkers, as many people do, you know, you can see where that goes, you know, for me. But anyway, here's the starting point anyway. So it starts with a very common and familiar criticism of utilitarianism. So the view that, you know, actions are right and wrong because, and to the extent that they make the world a better place, they contain more utility, well-being. And this moral theory is often criticized for not taking seriously what's called the separateness of persons. The rough idea there is that utilitarianism treats people as mattering kind of only as a container of welfare, as a place where welfare happens, rather than as people who matter kind of for their own right. And the thought is that you know, the right moral theory, whatever it is, should reflect the fact that persons matter and not just their welfare. You know, we're not just places where the value of utility resides, kind of we matter for our own sake. Or another way of putting it, you might say the right moral theory should capture the thought that our welfare matters because we matter. Lots of ways of articulating this thought, but I think it should be familiar to lots of you. So here's my thoughts. I think the power to control the use of one's good, which I've been positing as an explanation of the distinctive wrong of paternalism, is a kind of reflection or a constituent of the thought that persons are separate and independent. So the thought is, were we to lack this power, which I claim people have, we wouldn't matter in the way that we take ourselves to matter. So let me just give you a couple of illustrations of the separateness of persons' thoughts, and I'll finish just with not really an argument, rather just an assertion that the power to control the use of one's good, and I think kind of the essence of anti-paternalism, is a kind of further reflection of the intuition which leads us to something like the separateness of persons critique. So classic illustration is cases of interpersonal trade-offs. So imagine you have two options. Firstly, you can give Bob 5 units of cost and 6 units of benefit, or you can give Bob 5 units of cost and give a different person, Joe, 6 units of benefit. Imagine you have that choice. Well, it looks like, according to kind of simple utilitarianism, we should be indifferent between those two options, because whatever you do, the world is made better off by kind of 1 unit of utility. But most people don't think we should be indifferent between these two choices. They seem morally asymmetric. It looks like it's much easier to justify giving, in the first example, giving Bob, I should have given these people separate names, shouldn't I? I did. No, sorry. It seems much easier to justify imposing a burden in the first case, where Bob reaps the benefit, than in the second case, where Bob suffers the cost but doesn't reap the benefit. Joe gets the benefit, a different person. So as my colleague Mike Otsuka, I think, captures the intuition quite nicely, it really seems to matter whether a certain quantity of utility falls within the boundary of one person's life or another's. Right. So upshot of this kind of intuition, I think the correct moral theory needs to include some sort of constraints on interpersonal trade-offs. Interpersonal trade-offs seem harder to justify than intrapersonal trade-offs. Second kind of case, which I think also manifests the separateness of persons intuition, although it often isn't discussed in those terms, is cases of self-benefit. So here's another example for you. Imagine you have Sally. Sally has 2 options. She can either give herself 10 units of benefit, or she can give a stranger 8 units. What does utilitarianism, at least in its very simple form, say about this kind of choice? Seems to imply Sally is required to give herself the 10 units of benefit. She'd act wrongly if she gave the 8 units to a stranger. Most people find that very counterintuitive. It seems perfectly permissible for Sally to kind of sacrifice 2 units of good and give 8 units to somebody else. It doesn't look like she's required to treat her own well-being in the same way that she's required to relate to the well-being of other people. And again, it seems to really matter where the good is located. That's the key kind of take-home message. And it looks like the upshot, thinking about these cases, is something like this. The correct moral theory must include what Shelley Kagan calls options of generosity. Options to kind of sacrifice some of your own well-being, even for the sake of a smaller total quantity of well-being given to somebody else. Okay. Final point. So I think the essence of the previous 2 slides is simply to draw out the thought that if you think utilitarianism goes wrong in these cases, it goes wrong because, as I put it, it's kind of location insensitive. It doesn't care about kind of where benefits arise, just cares about the total quantity of good in the world. So it strikes me that that's just one way of articulating the essence of the separateness of persons critique. So in other words, the right moral theory should reflect the idea that there's this fundamental distinction between my good and yours. So here's my proposal. I think alongside very intuitive kind of constraints on interpersonal trade-offs, as we saw in kind of the first example, and also options not to self-benefit, as we saw in the second case, I think we also need something like the power to control the use of our good to sort of complete the set, so to speak, to kind of, we might think of these 3 elements as desiderata of a moral theory which genuinely takes seriously the idea of location sensitivity or the separateness of persons. So the basic idea here is something like a moral theory which didn't include something like the power to control the use of one's good, didn't include this special anti-paternalist constraint on promoting the good, would be kind of only half-heartedly committed to the separateness of persons, to the fundamental idea that there's a important moral distinction between mine and thine when it comes to welfare. That's the thought. So, we enjoy a higher moral status if we have the power to control the use of one's good than if we don't. By hypothesis, we do have a high moral status, therefore we have the power. Just echoing Cam and Nagel's style of argument. Okay, great. I'll leave things there. I'm looking forward to seeing where you think all of this goes wrong. Thanks a lot.